Well, a very good morning, everybody. Hi, it's Cassim, and welcome back again to my podcast. I really appreciate it. Um, I'm going to do something slightly a bit different today. I recently created a 90-minute free workshop, which I am going to be doing for businesses in Reading. Um, to encourage really a conversation around shame, to encourage men to come to therapy, to encourage men to seek mental health support. Many of you will be aware that the suicide rate for boys and men has been increasing over the last 10 years or so, and the biggest killer of men under the age of 50 is men die by suicide. Um, and one of the best positions and the best people who are positioned to support these men and to signpost them and to notice any signs that these men may be struggling, of course, are their workplaces, because the vast majority of boys and men spend the vast majority of their time at work or asleep. And so I wanted to create this free workshop, which is entitled, How Can We Move from Shame to Support, Making Mental Health Normal for Boys and Men in Reading? So I'm just going to present it and I hope it's useful. Um, I'm going to do this in two parts because I don't want to make this, the entire workshop is 90 minutes and I want to try and make this 40 minutes today and then I'll give you the other 40 minutes next week or 50 minutes or whatever it may be. So, I'm just literally going to present it as I would usually if I'm at a business or I'm in front of some young men or I'm in front of some leaders or CEOs. And I hope you find it useful. So thank you very, very much for taking the time to listen to me. My name is Kasim, and I'm a qualified psychotherapist and a member of the National Counseling Society. I have a private practice here in Reading in Berkshire, which is specifically aimed at boys and men. That does not mean that I do not cater to other people, but my practice is specifically aimed at boys and men. I'm a level five qualified psychotherapist, and if you'd like to see my credentials are here. So not only am I a qualified psychotherapist, I'm also a qualified designated safeguarding lead for schools and colleges. I have an award in education training as well as a universal safeguarding training. I've got a level three diploma in hypnotherapy and an introduction to counseling skills. I've got a 6 month foundation course in acting. My background is that I've had 28 jobs. One of which is that I made an early school in Reading as a behavior support worker, which is a secondary school. I currently work for the largest online digital mental health organization in the UK, which is called Kooth. And my job is I'm the engagement lead, and essentially my job is to go across Southwest London and speak to CAMS workers, foster workers, adoption agencies, CAMS, school nurses, pastoral staff, young people, essentially anyone who is between the ages of 10 and 25 or anyone who deals with anybody who is between the age of 10 and 25 in the boroughs of Merton, Sutton, Croydon, Wandsworth, Richmond, and Kingston. My job is to speak to them about Kooth, which has meant that I have spoken to a lot of people. I've spoken at primary schools, high schools, I've spoken at and done training at secondary schools, at colleges, sixth forms, universities. I've spoken at private schools, independent schools, you name it. I've been and spoken. I've also written 6 books about around the topic of male mental health. And I am currently training to become a marriage counselor and doing a level six research paper uh, on the psychological reasons why some men abandon their children and become absent fathers or estranged from their biological children. Just a word of warning, because of the nature of the topic that we're going to talk about today, we are going to be talking about some emotionally sensitive or triggering stuff, material. That may include trauma, abuse, shame, emotional neglect, mental health, struggles of boys and men. So if you are listening to me, please can I ask you to take care of yourself? You may at times find that you need to, for example, pause or take a minute or come back to this at a certain time. Please do so. Um, or if you are indeed in crisis, please dial 999 or reach out to Samaritans. Please, if you're struggling, do not just keep it in. Reach out to somebody if you are in crisis. Your well-being comes first. Some time ago, last year, I think, no, it was this year actually, I wrote a book called Why Should I Talk About My Feelings? I'm a Man, How to Get Boys and Men into Therapy. And I began that book off with something that I wanted to share with you and read to you. I hope you find it useful. Here we go. In January of 2025, as wildfires ripped across parts of Los Angeles, I found myself sitting in a McDonald's on the outskirts of Leicester, having arrived early in order to avoid morning rush hour traffic for a 2-day designated safeguarding lead course I was taking. As I tried to dip my hash brown into the tiny white pot of ketchup, my attention was drawn to a little girl playing nearby with her mother. She couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old, with big blue eyes, brown hair tied back in a ponytail, a pink Nike puffer jacket, and matching pink Nike trainers. They were playing on one of those machines where you drop a coin in and it swirls round and round and round before disappearing into the slot at the bottom. The little girl was completely excited by this simple task, her face lighting up with pure joy and excitement as a coin spiraled down. Watching her, I couldn't help but smile and think, how can a child find so much happiness in something so simple? But then that joy of watching her lost its intensity as I thought about the course I was about to take. I started reflecting on what safeguarding was all about. At its core and at its heart, it's meant to stop abuse, harm, or neglect from happening. One of its main aims is to protect children's health and development and make sure they grow up in a safe, caring environment. But then I found myself asking an even bigger question. Why do we even need to prevent harm to children in the first place? Why would anyone want to hurt a child? Every parent I know would do whatever it takes to keep their child safe. So how does it happen? How do people even get the chance to harm children? I started to realize that safeguarding mostly focuses on protecting children from physical harm. And don't get me wrong, that's hugely important, but it doesn't always protect them from the other types of harm, like emotional abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse, or even harm caused by organizations or institutions. It doesn't always safeguard against financial exploitation, discrimination, or situations where young children are trapped in modern slavery families. Safeguarding is highly effective in protecting children and young people who are visibly struggling, those facing clear challenges in their families, in their family environment, or experiencing multiple adverse experiences. It works well in situations where a single parent is raising multiple children alone, when a child is frequently late to school, absent altogether, or arriving unkept. It also provides effective when a student's behavior is disruptive or when concerns arise, such as being caught stealing. In these cases, safeguarding interventions can make a real difference, but safeguarding often misses the children who appear to be living in stable, picture perfect families. These are the kids growing up in households where both parents are present, both have good jobs, the family is financially secure, and they attend religious services at the mosque, church, or temple. It doesn't account for situations where caregivers are respected pillars of the community, like religious leaders. When a child from this kind of background doesn't outwardly show signs of struggle, maybe they're masking their pain or they're just managing to cope, they can slip through the cracks. Yet, between the ages of 0 and 18, immense emotional, spiritual, and psychological harm can still occur. Even if everything looks fine on the surface, safeguarding as it stands often overlooks these children, leaving them vulnerable to damage that's harder to detect, but no less significant. That little girl was brimming with potential, curiosity, and delight. Yet somewhere along the way, many of us lose that spark. Something shifts between childhood and adulthood, something that seems to interfere with how we function as human beings. I've often wondered what that something is, especially when it comes to boys and men. I just haven't been able to reconcile or understand how a child born innocent, as every child must be, can grow into something we later see presenting with high narcissistic traits. Someone with bipolar disorder or someone who's clinically depressed has generalized anxiety or disorder or struggles with psychotic episodes. How does a child become someone exhibiting antisocial behavior, involved in criminal activity, an abuser, or addicted to drugs, ultimately destroying themselves and those around them? In my pursuit of answering this question and trying to figure things out, I came across something called therapy. Now, I know that if you're reading this, or in this case, you're listening to me, therapy might seem like an obvious place to start answering some of these questions, but it wasn't to me. I've come to realize it's not obvious for many boys and men, particularly those from different cultural backgrounds. What I've discovered is that therapy doesn't just begin to explain what happened in the gap between innocence and dysfunction, it also has the power to heal. Therapy can help boys and men transform, grow, and discover parts of themselves that were repressed, detached, fractured, split, or lost along the way. It can even unlock parts of themselves that they didn't know existed. I wanted to tell as many people as I could about it because I was one of the people that it helped. Now, many of us will know that when we are born into various systems, and we don't get to choose these systems. We may be born into the family system, the education system, the healthcare system, the workplace system, the criminal justice system, the social welfare system, the legal system, the community and religious systems, the media and cultural systems. And all of these systems have certain pressures and expectations and standards that we have to abide by. And the problem with these systems is that these systems do not ask us to change, do not tailor themselves to us. We as a people have to change and tailor ourselves to the systems. And the problem with this is that we as a people have certain developmental needs, right? So, for example, if you look at the core domains of the self, as a child is born, they will have in their early development, and we're talking about infancy to early childhood, certain needs that they need to fulfill. So, for example, they will have body, health, energy, hormones, sleep, illness, and pain. They'll have emotional needs like feelings, mood, expression, emotional literacy, right? They'll have relational and social connection, intimacy, friendship, boundaries, tribe. They'll also have environmental needs like living spaces, nature, sensory, safety. Then, as they move up into their adolescence, and childhood into adolescence, they'll have physical needs. They're gonna develop into their thoughts, beliefs, identity, mental resilience. They're gonna have their habits develop, coping mechanisms, addictions. Self-sabotage is gonna occur around this time. Things like race, gender, class, religion, belonging are gonna start to develop. Then you're gonna have the sexual side of things where they're gonna have desire, arousal, orientation, expression, shame, masculinity starts to kick in. Then you're going to look at the intellectual way they're going to become curious. They're going to start learning. They're going to start problem solving and reasoning. And then as they move into their young adult to adulthood, other things beyond themselves start to take place. So, for example, things like money, work, status, security, ambition, risk, then you've got things like the vocational stuff where you've got things like mission, career, contribution, leadership, impact. And there's also, of course, a spiritual side around purpose, meaning, soul, values, and transcendence. And the problem is that, as I said, if somebody grows up in one of these systems, the education system, the family system, and that system is not ideal, what can end up happening is that system can crush a child. I've always been curious as to multiple personality disorder. For example, in the case of Jenny Haynes built 2,500 multiple personalities that saved her from her shocking childhood. She says in a 60-minute program that between the ages of 4 and 11, she experienced sexual abuse from her father. And she said in this 60-minute interview that her father chose to inflict severe, sadistic, violent abuse. He did this every day of her entire childhood. But here's what I've been really interested in. And this is really part of what led me to become a psychotherapist. What I really wanted to know is why? How is it that this woman, this child, in spite of all of this, in spite of the trauma, in spite of the neglect, in spite of the abuse, Jenny can go on to get a master's in a degree in psychology, a master's in legal studies and criminal justice, a PhD in victimology, crime and trauma, where that PhD is focusing on victims of crime, and extensive doctorate research dedicated to criminal psychology, and the impact of crime on survivors. How? And what I went on to discover is that all of us have these sort of domains. We have the physical, the mental, the spiritual, and the emotional. And the human mind is so clever that when you're a child and you're growing up and you are brought up into a system which basically interferes with the development of any of these core elements of who you are, what will happen is that the body will actually shut off and it will protect itself, and it will go into things like depression, suppression, um, splitting. I'm going to go into a lot of these in a bit. But what I basically wanted to just say, beginning off, is when we look at people who we call dysfunctional, people who are really struggling, having mental health issues, before we go into judgment, I think that one of the things that we have to remember is that what we see as dysfunction, them drinking alcohol, them depressed all the time, that is not how nature intended for them to be, but those are survival mechanisms. They're survival strategies. I remember there's an American psychologist, a guy called Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers is one of the founders of humanistic psychology. Carl Rogers basically believed that human beings have one basic motive, which is a tendency to self-actualize and fulfill one's potential and achieve the highest levels of human beingness that we can. According to Rogers, people could only self-actualize if they had a positive view of themselves, what he called a positive self-regard. He wrote a book in 1980 called A Way of Being, and I'd like to read you something from it. It's one of the most impactful things and really changed the course of my life. This is what he said. I remember that in my boyhood, the bin in which we stored our winter supply of potatoes was in the basement, several feet below a small window. The conditions were unfavorable, but the potatoes would begin to sprout, pale white sprouts. So unlike the healthy green sprouts they sent up when planted in the soil in the spring, but these sad, spindling sprouts would grow 2 or 3 feet in length as they reached towards the disc light of the window. The sprouts growth, were in their bizarre, futile growth, a sort of desperate expression of the directional tendency I have been describing. They would never become plants, never mature, never fulfill their real potential, but under the most adverse circumstances, they were striving to become. Life would not give up even if it could not flourish. In dealing with clients whose lives have been terribly warped, in working with men and women on the back wards of state hospitals, I often think of those potato sprouts. So unfavorable have been the conditions in which these people have developed that their lives often seem abnormal, twisted, scarcely human. Yet, the directional tendency in them can be trusted. The clue to understanding their behavior is that they're striving in the only way that they perceive as available to them to move toward growth, toward becoming. To healthy persons, the results may seem bizarre and futile, but they are life's desperate attempt to become itself. And so, one of the things that I really just want to let you know is you may be listening to me as a boy or man, and you may have gone through a lot. You may have, for example, of survived a lot of abuse. You may have gone through a lot of trauma. You may have had an abusive father or a neglectful mother. You may have been abandoned. You may have gone through a lot of bullying. And I just want to let you know that you're stronger than what you think. It's really the first thing that I just want to let you're here. You're alive. Now, you may not be living up to your full potential, but I just want to let you know and just demonstrate and just remind you of the capacity of human beings. And the human mind is so powerful and it has this such a desire to live and to grow and to survive that it will create these severe survival defense mechanisms in response to trauma. Some of these are, for example, the multiple personality or what we call dissociative identity disorder that I talked about earlier on. You've got maladaptive daydreaming, you've got fawn response, you've got emotional numbing, you've got borderline splitting, right? Where people view people either as good or bad. You've got somatic and physical expression of emotional pain, where trauma is literally expressed through physical symptoms. Have you ever met someone who's constantly ill, constantly got a problem, constantly got a sickness? It could be, I'm not saying that it is, it could be that that person's way of surviving is that they've learned to take the pain that they experience and the trauma and put it in their body. In fact, let's look at the definition of trauma. Dr. Gabor Mate said that trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you, right? Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the author of The Body Keeps Score, a book I'd highly recommend, said that trauma is the invisible force that shapes our lives. It shapes the way that we live, the way that we love, and the way that we make sense of the world. So one of the first things that the other things that I just wanted to say is the same thing that two people can go through the same traumatic event and how they deal with it and what they felt about it will be completely different. And I'll give you a demonstration of this because I think it's one of the easiest demonstrations for people to understand. There is a lot of boys and men who have had sex with women who are way older than them whilst they are under the age of 18. Now, the legal definition would define this as rape. However, and this is where it gets interesting, for the vast majority of boys and men, they do not see this as rape. They see this as absolutely amazing. They've got laid. They've managed to get with an older woman. But if the same situation were to happen to a woman, as a general rule, and of course there's always anomalies, there's always exceptions, this would be considered as rape. This would be considered as traumatic because of the power dynamics, because of the ages, because of consent. Meaning that I've spoken to so many men in therapy who a woman had sex with them when they were 14, when they were 15, and that woman may have been 30, 40 years of age, but they have not, the meaning that they've made from it is not that they were raped, it's that this was an amazing experience. Now, this gets complicated because you can actually experience physical trauma, but not create the meaning that it was traumatic. And so one of the things that I just want to say off starting off the block is that we all are different. I remember many years ago, I read a book and a woman said something that I'll never forget. She said that we shouldn't trauma compare, and she says there is no hierarchy in suffering. One of the biggest things and the biggest reasons why a lot of boys and men do not reach out for help and ask for help is because they do what I just said, which is trauma comparison. They may look at their mother, they may look at the world, and they may say, my God, look at that person who's struggling. They've gone through cancer, they have lost a child, and what they've gone through is far much worse than me having depression, anxiety. But one of the first things that I just want to let you know as a boy and man, and anyone who is working with boys and men, and if you see a boy and man, is to validate them, is to remind them that what they've experienced and what they're struggling with is valid. That it doesn't, they don't have to have a broken leg, be in hospital, have a piece of their internal body coming out of them, like a broken leg. It is possible to be hurting, and the hurt isn't physical. It can be emotional, it can be spiritual. I remember I went through a phase in my life after losing my biological father where I was grieving. And I never even knew that you could grieve for somebody who you'd never met because I'd never met my biological father. He died when I was 10 years of age. And I don't know if any of you, this is actually quite something it begins to get quite interesting because sometimes I'll work with clients in therapy and they grieve harder and more impacted by the death of their dog or their cat than they are of a human being. And this can seem very weird to some people. And this is why I say that it's not necessarily what happened, but it's what it did to you inside, what it meant to you, which is much more impactful, right? And so, one of the other things that I really want to just illustrate and is about something I'm about to get onto, which is compounding. Because a lot of people, and in fact, let me skip forward a little bit because I'm going to get back to this. Um, a lot of us, when we tend to think about trauma, we tend to think about trauma in terms of big, what we call big T traumas. So big T traumas are those obvious, usually often life-threatening or deeply shocking events that can overwhelm a person's ability to cope. So this is things like physical or sexual abuse, war or terrorism, car crashes, natural disasters, serious illnesses or medical procedures, sudden loss of a loved one, witnessing violence, right? So big T traumas often meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in the DSM, which is the diagnostic, I can't even speak today, the diagnostic DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, right? And there are different variations of this. But what I think a lot of us forget, and here's a question for you. Can you give me an example of a T trauma? Because you've got big T traumas, but you've also got small T traumas. But let me give you a definition of it so you can think before I give this to you. So small T trauma is often is accumulative and is a series of smaller wounds over time that eventually become overwhelming. It might not cause PTSD, but it can lead to anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and emotional dysregulation. These are subtle but emotionally significant events that disrupt your sense of self, identity, and emotional well-being. They often seem traumatic to others, but can deeply, oh, sorry, they may not seem deeply traumatic to others, but they can deeply impact the individual. So I'm going to come back to in a minute. I'm going to ask you to start thinking about some examples of what you think this is, but I want to go back to this. So this is a compound interest calculator. And as you can see here, basically, for those of you who are listening to me, what people are seeing is an online compound calculator where I've put in an initial investment of £200. And this is basically forecasting over the next 20 years what would happen if you put £200, starting over £200 into a savings account and every single month you put in £200, and what would happen as it compounded over the next 20 years. And over the next 20 years, if you just keep going, you will have compounded £88,486 if you're one person. But if you're two people and you save £400 every single month, you would have compounded and saved within the same time 176,973. The reason why I'm saying this is because there are some people, boys and men, who, based on what they've gone through and what they've experienced, they've developed a shark mentality. A mentality where they've learned that in order for me to survive, Kasim, I have to not trust anybody, not believe anybody, not rely on anybody. I've got to do everything myself. But the problem with this is that there is a saying which goes something like, if you want to go fast, go by yourself. But if you want to go far, take others with you. In other words, they've developed the belief system and the survival mechanism that in order for them to survive, in order for them to thrive, in order for them to fulfill their potential, they're going to have to cut everybody out. But the problem is when you are operating in the world by yourself, the equation that you do is what I call a one plus one, meaning you can only ever add. But once you link up with other people and you start combining and elaborating, what ends up happening is you begin to do a multiplication. Meaning, if me and you are working together, or you're working with a psychotherapist, or you're working with your GP, or you're working with a relationship coach, or you go to pre-marriage counseling, or you're working as part of a team, what will end up happening is there's two of us. So the problem that you're experiencing, you're not solving by yourself. What is actually happening is we're both solving the problem. And by the way, just bear with me 1 second because I want to close this window because as I'm recording this, there is a somebody who is cutting. What do you call it? This is actually a perfect demonstration. Somebody's cutting the grass, but this is a perfect demonstration of uh, of life happens, right? Life happens, things happen. But anyway, what I was saying is that when you're doing things by yourself, what can end up happening is that you end up being limited. I say to people that once you've reached 10, in order to get to 20, you have to go back to 1. So 10, 11, 12, 13, which requires humility. You have to actually ask for help because what I've observed happens to a lot of boys and men is when they experience these small T traumas, individually, they're not actually bad. But because a lot of boys and men have been brought up in a world which is conditioned to them for them to be stoic. British society once has conditioned boys to be strong, be mummy's little soldier, toughen up, don't cry like a baby, don't show weakness. What can end up happening is that these individual things that happen to them, they don't realize the significance of them. And what happens is over the years, over the period of 30, 40 years, these compound. So small T traumas which are often experienced by men are things like repeated bullying, parental neglect or emotional invalidation, um, being shamed or humiliated, growing up in a household with constant conflict, breakups, divorce or job losses, being made redundant, failing an important exam, going ongoing microaggressions of discrimination, being told to man up or not to cry, being told and being asked to, and going and being placed in a position of the emotional caretaker in the family, having no emotional available male role models, pressure to provide financially while silently struggling, being compared to more successful siblings or peers, have many of you heard, why can't you just be like your brother or your sister? Being rejected or excluded in social or romantic situations, which is now with online dating, people are being rejected all the time and it breeds resentment. Witnessing domestic violence without being the direct victim of them, being forced into gender roles that feel unnatural or restrictive, having to hide one's sexuality or beliefs or sensitivity. There are some people who've been brought up in a family system where they're the sensitive one, and they've got this overbearing and domineering father. And do you know what that does? That takes the essence of somebody and it shrinks it down and diminishes it. But also the other thing is, in terms of sexuality, there are some people who are freaky. There are some people who are bi, who are gay, and because of their community or religion, they've had to be these down low men. Down low men are men who are gay or bi, but they end up in a relationship with a woman, but they have sexual relations with men in secret. Um, Hiding, losing your sense of purpose after like a redundancy, an injury or retirement. But also attached to this is losing your sense of identity, constant criticism or never feeling good. Why can't you get things right? You're pathetic, you're dumb, you're stupid. Why can't you get anything correct? Being punished for expressing vulnerability of softness, experiencing racism, xenophobia, or homophobia without having a safe space to process this, lack of recognition or praise in school, work, or at home, emotional abandonment after a miscarriage or family crisis, feeling invisible or replaceable in a workplace or relationship, or being treated only as a protector or provider and not as the full person. And even for some people, what ends up happening is they may have ADHD and they've never even known that they have ADHD. So you have things like masking. We know from statistics and data that ADHD rates amongst boys and men in the UK is that between 5 to 17-year-olds who were surveyed in 2018, the data tells us that about 3.5% of boys have ADHD and 1.8% of girls have ADHD. That tells us can you imagine, and this is just only recently, and what I would say is, can you imagine how many boys and men have gone through their entire life and they've not even recognized that they've got ADHD? They don't even know. They've never got support. They've never been validated. They've always been masking, and they thought, and they don't even realize that they're masking. And then, of course, then when we look at something like dyslexia, we are told that at least 1 in 10 people are thought to be affected by dyslexia. Right. And there are all of these forms, and there is an adult screening checklist, which was developed in conjunction with Professor Tim Miles of Bangor University for following empirical research by Dr. Ross at the London South Bank University. This checklist does not obviously attempt to record the talents, skills, or potentials which are linked with dyslexia, but it does begin to help you get self-awareness, have introspection, reflect, look at what your strengths are. There's a lot of boys and men who operate their lives from feeling like they have no strengths. Everything is a weakness. Okay. Um, I'm going to let me finish this off because I think it's useful. What happens is that a lot of people, as I've been saying, men end up often stuck in these roles because of the systems that they've grown up in. Whether that is I actually wrote a book, well, I haven't wrote the book yet, but I'm in the process of writing a book in which I talk about. So I used to work in a school, and when I used to work in the school, I was looking at all the children who came into the behavior support team and why it is that they kept coming in there. And I started to study these kids, and I found that these kids essentially were struggling with five things, which were the roles. They didn't know what their role was in school. They didn't know what their role was in their family. Laws and principles. There were certain things that could not change, like the timing of the school. So they would turn up to school whenever they wanted because they didn't like the way the school timing was. There were certain things that they set off the fire alarm when this is universally people know that you shouldn't fiddle with things like fire alarms, fire extinguishers, that kind of stuff. They seasons and cycles, they will do the right thing, but they do it at the wrong time, or they will do the wrong thing at the right time. And so, or they just weren't, they didn't, well, they weren't very good with timing. And then there was, of course, rules. So they had their own rules, and then the school had its own rules, and they didn't understand that there were rules in the playground. There are rules if you're playing with younger kids. Like some of them would get into relationships with students who are younger than them when they're in year 11. A year 11 student cannot get into a relationship with a year 7 student, and these rules are not allowed. But they would want to do what they wanted to do. And then the last one that they really were struggling with were basics and fundamentals. They really just hadn't mastered basics and fundamentals. They would try to basically do the showy thing, the amazing thing, but they hadn't mastered the basics. And for example, when I meet people in relationships, when I'm working with people, sometimes I say to men, have you mastered the basics of cooking? Because one of the most wonderful things that binds people is food. Can you cook a spaghetti bolognese for your spouse? Can you cook a breakfast for your spouse? This is what improves your relationship, right? Are you the kind of person who understands how to change the bed sheets? Do you know how to do the washing? Do you brush your teeth? Do you wash your hair? Hygiene, because I meet some boys and men who think that they're unworthy, who no one likes them, but actually they haven't mastered the basics of have you got a job? Are you consistent in that job? Are you hygienic? Do you brush your teeth? You know, as the young people would call it, glow ups. Have you gone through your period of glowing up? Because what ends up happening for some people is they end up struggling because they haven't mastered these, and they end up developing this mindset where um, they live in these life positions, and there are four life positions. So there is a type of therapy called TA, transactional analysis, which is basically uses a method of analysis to of process of transactions in communication with others. And it requires us to be aware of how we think, we feel, and behave during interactions with others. So um, a huge amount of TA was driven by a guy called Sigmund Freud. Um, and essentially, what ends up happening is that, you know what, I'm going to stop here because this is too complex for me to get into. And I really wanted to stop this podcast here today. But I will come back to this next week when I talk to you about this subject because I think it's going to be really, really useful when we go into these transactional analysis and the positions of I'm okay, you're okay, I'm not okay, you're okay, I'm okay, you are not okay, and I am not okay, you are not okay. I think it's going to be really, really, really useful. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the parent, adult, and child, and how that looks for people. So, as usual, thank you very, very much for listening. I hope you found it useful, what I've talked about today. I hope it's added some value to you. Join me again next week, and we will continue this workshop talking about shame. I haven't even got into shame yet, but I really wanted to set this up so that people understand from a male perspective some of the challenges that men experience developmentally. Thanks very much. Like, subscribe, and all of that sort of stuff, please, guys. And I'll speak to you very soon. Bye for now.